Good afternoon and welcome to our Institution of Mechanical Engineers webinar today on the environmental aspects of offshore decommissioning. This has been organised by the Upstream Oil and Gas Committee of the IMechE, and we're very pleased to have so many of you here with us today. Now, before we start, a quick note on how to ask questions. If you look beneath the presentation slides there, you'll see an Ask a Question box. Please type your questions in there. We'll be answering all the questions after the presentation, so we'll go through the presentation and then Ian, our speaker today, will answer all those questions, and I'll be sort of acting as the chair for that session. I think that's probably about it now, so over to our speaker today, Ian Tartley.
Hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar on the environmental aspects of offshore decommissioning. My name is Ian Tartley, and I manage the Environmental Consultancy Group at Fraser-Nash Consultancy. We only have half an hour. I can't cover everything. I'll try my best, but it will be a whistle-stop tour. I'll start by providing a little bit of context around the policy and regulatory framework governing environmental appraisal for decommissioning offshore assets. I'll then discuss some of the practicalities and approaches to undertaking the environmental appraisal for offshore decommissioning. We'll then move on to a question and answer session. As I give the talk, there is some key terminology I'm going to use that's probably worth me running through at the moment. In particular, when I say environmental aspect, I mean an element of an organization's activities, products, or services that can interact with the environment. When I say environmental impact, this is a planned or known or expected impact upon the environment. When I say environmental risk, this is an unplanned or unexpected event that gives rise to environmental harm, so something accidental. I apologize that I may even drop in the occasional acronym. When I say BEP, what I mean is best environmental practice. This is the application of the most appropriate combination of environmental control measures and strategies. When I say BAT, I'm not talking about the flying kind. What I mean is best available techniques, which are the latest stage of development, so state-of-the-art process or facilities or methods of operation, which indicate the practical suitability of a particular measure for limiting discharges, emissions, and waste. I'll also talk about the source pathway receptor model, where the source is where the pollution comes from, the pathway is how pollution travels through the environment, and receptors are who or what could be affected. The key when I'm talking about the source pathway receptor model is that all three need to be considered carefully when thinking about environmental impacts and risks. The decommissioning of offshore oil and gas installations and pipelines on the UK continental shelf is controlled via the 1998 Petroleum Act. Part 4 of the 1998 Act provides a framework for decommissioning disused offshore installations and pipelines. It's been amended a number of times, most notably by the 2008 and 2016 Energy Acts. Decommissioning is regulated by the Offshore Petroleum Regulator for the Environment and Decommissioning, which is part of the Energy Development and Resilience Directorate at BASE. They regulate using powers set out in the 1998 Act. The UK government is signatory to a number of international conventions that govern activities in the marine environment. Some of these place obligations which impact on offshore oil and gas, and more specifically upon the decommissioning of offshore assets. To put this into a bit more context, the United Kingdom's international obligations and policies on the decommissioning of offshore installations have origins in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. This entered into force in 1994 and includes a requirement that any installations or structures which are abandoned or disused should be removed to ensure safety of navigation. It also includes a requirement that the removal of the assets should have due regard to fishing and the protection of the marine environment. In 1992, the Convention on the Protection of the Marine Environment in the Northeast Atlantic, so the OSPAR Convention, was agreed. The most significant obligations for decommissioning offshore oil and gas operations as set out in OSPAR Decision 98.3, which requires that the topside of all installations must be returned to shore, and that all steel installations with jacket weight less than 10,000 tonnes in air must be completely removed for reuse, recycling or final disposal on land. The decision recognises that it might be difficult to remove the footings of large steel jackets weighing more than 10,000 tonnes. Similarly, it acknowledges difficulties with removal of concrete installations. As a result, there is a facility for derogation from the main requirements of OSPAR. This is, however, limited to those large steel installations installed before February 1999. This is something that's reviewed regularly, but to date there have not been any justifiable changes to the derogation criteria. Linking this back to the regulatory context, OPRED is the competent authority on decommissioning in the UK for OSPAR purposes. So, I hear you ask, how do these obligations translate into a requirement for environmental assessment? Well, the UK government policy and practices on decommissioning are underpinned by two key principles. A precautionary principle that decommissioning should aim to achieve a clear seabed, whilst acknowledging that this will not always be achievable, and a polluter pays principle. This sets out an expectation that organisations who have benefited from exploitation or production of hydrocarbons in the UK continental shelf will bear responsibility for decommissioning and any clean-up if it's required. These set the scene for the need to characterise and understand the environmental impacts and risks associated with an offshore decommissioning process and its associated decommissioning programme. Practically, there are 5 key stages in the decommissioning process. These start before cessation of production and continue via early identification of options to detailed assessment and drafting of the decommissioning programme that is submitted to base. At stage 2 of this process, a decommissioning programme is submitted to base for consultation. This goes to OPRED and other interested parties for consideration. At stage 3, there is a formal submission of the decommissioning programme in the hope of approval under the 1998 Act. The chosen decommissioning options set out in the decommissioning programme must be supported by an environmental appraisal at both stages. This should assess the impact of the project on the environment and include information on the energy balance and emissions of the decommissioning options considered. The appraisal also needs to consider the environmental impact of any explosives likely deployed during decommissioning activity. I thought it would also be worthwhile to highlight some of the other environmentally focused legislation relevant to decommissioning. In particular, there are a few key principles I thought it would be worth raising. This is to set a bit more context for the way in which environmental compliance is monitored and regulated for decommissioning project. Firstly, I think it's important to clarify that there is a difference between an environmental appraisal and a statutory EIA under the 2014 EIA directive. There is no requirement to undertake an environmental impact assessment that satisfies the 2014 EIA directive. Under the 1998 Petroleum Act, there is a more straightforward requirement to undertake an assessment of the potential environmental impacts of the proposed decommissioning proposal. An environmental assessment should be proportional to the proposed decommissioning activities, the potential environmental impacts, and the sensitivities of the marine environment in the vicinity of the activities. It should describe the potential environmental impacts of the selected decommissioning option. A more detailed assessment should be undertaken for any potentially significant environmental impacts. It is worth noting that this subtlety doesn't mean it's simple. There are still lots of stakeholders to consider. The environmental appraisal also forms part of the decommissioning programme that is signed off by OPRED, so it is worth getting it right. Now that I've cleared that up, I'll have a quick run through some of the other legislation and requirements that it's worth being conscious of. I'm not going to cover everything. I'm just going to provide a flavour of some of the statutory considerations that need to be accounted for. There may be requirements for marine licences under the Marine and Coastal Access Act or the Food and Environmental Protection Act for deposits in the sea. There may be a requirement for chemical permits for the use or discharge of offshore chemicals. These would be under the Offshore Chemicals Regulations. Under the Offshore Petroleum Activities, Oil Prevention, Pollution Prevention and Control Regulations, there may be a need for oil discharge permits. There may be a need for marine survey consents, such as marine geological survey consents under Offshore Petroleum Activities Conservation of Habitats Regulations. It may be necessary to obtain licenses for European protected species that may be injured or disturbed. These would be under the Conservation of Offshore Marine Habitats and Species Regulations. It may be necessary to amend atmospheric emissions permits under the Offshore Combustion Installation Pollution Prevention and Control Regulations. Likewise, there may be a need to amend greenhouse gas emissions permits under the Greenhouse Gas Emission Trading Scheme Regulations. There's also likely to be a requirement to develop an oil pollution emergency plan under the Merchant Shipping Oil Pollution Preparedness Response and Cooperation Convention Regulations. Another area of legislation that's well worth dwelling on for a moment is habitats legislation, in particular the EU Habitats Directive and the EU Birds Directive. This is particularly relevant as these feed directly into the environmental appraisal process and characterisation of the baseline environment, which is something that I'll cover later. The EU Birds Directive requires Member States to nominate sites as special protection areas. The EU Habitats Directive lists habitats and species whose conservation requires the designation of protected areas. These are protected by the creation of special areas of conservation. Protected habitats in UK offshore waters can include things like reefs, permanently submerged sandbanks, submarine structures made by leaking gases, and submerged or partially submerged sea caves. Protected species include things like the grey and common seal, bottlenose dolphin, and harbour porpoise. Cetaceans are protected from disturbance under Annex 4 of the Habitats Directive. The Offshore Petroleum Activities Conservation of Habitats Regulations applies the EC Habitats Directive and EC Wild Birds Directive to oil and gas plans and projects. Any plan or project that is likely to have a significant effect on a designated site must be subject to habitat regulations assessment. Where OPRED's environmental management team or a statutory nature conservation body considers that a decommissioning proposal is likely to have a significant effect on the integrity of a designated site, it's likely that OPRED, as the competent authority, will undertake the habitats regulation assessment. This will be during the decommissioning planning stage. The assessment may be limited to a screening assessment, which is sometimes called a likely significant effects assessment. In some cases, a full appropriate assessment may be required if the activity is considered likely to have a significant effect on the integrity of a designated site. Whilst the competent authority must complete the habitat regulation assessment, operators are expected to provide sufficient data and assessment information within their environmental appraisal to facilitate the process. We can't talk about decommissioning without mentioning waste management. There's a lot of legislation governing waste management across England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. The underpinning element of this legislation is the duty of care, concerning the waste producer's obligations with regards to managing the waste and ensuring its appropriate final disposal. There is also an obligation to follow the waste hierarchy. This ensures that all waste produced offshore is legally transported, recycled, reused or disposed of safely by competent authorised organisations and personnel. Base guidance makes specific recommendations that sufficient time is allocated for waste requirements and management as part of the decommissioning project. This is particularly pertinent where offshore waste is likely to be transported outside of the UK, when it will be subject to transfrontier shipment of waste regulations. When discussing wastes, it's also worth highlighting that the Radioactive Substances Act or environmental permitting regulations in England and Wales may apply to some decommissioning projects. These regulations apply to anyone who transfers or receives radioactive sources or radioactive waste for disposal. I think that's probably enough on legislation, so I'll move on to discuss stakeholders. Part of the disposal planning process requires operators to develop and manage a public consultation process. This should be proportionate to the level of interest from stakeholders. While stakeholder engagement and consultation is a topic in its own right, I'd like to highlight the complexity of stakeholder interactions associated with the decommissioning programme. This is because a large number of stakeholders may have relevant environmental concerns, constraints, or information. This should be considered as part of the environmental appraisal process. It's also worth noting that consulting and engaging with stakeholders provides a mechanism to support optioneering process and informed decision-making during the environmental appraisal. During the decommissioning planning process, OPRED will consult with government departments, agencies, and non-government agencies. This may include, but is not restricted to, organisations who will have some environmental concerns or constraints upon the programme. Some organisations may even have information that could support the environmental appraisal. The stakeholder engagement process can take up to 12 months, so it's recommended that the stakeholder consultation and communication process is well understood and considered, and that it commences at a very early stage. Oil and Gas UK has developed guidelines on stakeholder engagement for decommissioning activities. Having cantered through some of the background to the need for environmental appraisal, we can get into talking about the environmental appraisal itself. The decommissioning programme for an asset must include detail and supporting information on the potential environmental impacts of the proposed decommissioning activities. This is based upon a starting presumption that wherever possible, all offshore infrastructure will be reused, recycled, or disposed of on land. The environmental appraisal must be documented in an environmental appraisal report. This report should provide an assessment of the potential environmental impacts and risks associated with the selected decommissioning option. It should also include details of any mitigation measures or remedial works which may be required to manage or address the significant environmental impacts or risks. The next few slides outline a staged process that can be followed to deliver an environmental appraisal. This is aligned to the guidance developed by Decom North Sea. I focused on the marine elements of the environmental appraisal, noting that it is also incumbent upon operators to consider the environmental effects associated with onshore elements of their decommissioning plans. The environmental appraisal process can be broken down into 4 key steps. The first step is to define decommissioning activities and parameters, and to understand the nature and extent of proposed decommissioning activities. The second step is to identify potential decommissioning activities and environmental receptor interactions. The third step is to characterise the baseline environment. This is based on understanding the receiving environment and considering the relevant environmental aspects, impacts and risks that poses and that are posed by the decommissioning programme. Step 4 is to assess the significance of the environmental interactions, aspects, impacts and risks. At this stage, you'd also seek to define mitigation measures according to best environmental practice and best available techniques. Once this has been done, it's documented within an environmental assessment report. The first step of the environmental appraisal process is to understand the nature and extent of the proposed decommissioning activities as best as possible. I say as best as possible because we should acknowledge that operators may reserve the selection of detailed execution methodologies until a commercial tendering process for the work has been completed. Nevertheless, there is a requirement to provide sufficient information on the potential environmental impacts of the decommissioning activities. This is in order to identify relevant environmental constraints and appropriate mitigation, management and control measures. So, one way to deal with this is to define a set of project parameters based on an understanding of the most likely decommissioning activities. This can be done using a precautionary approach that sets parameters sufficiently wide to provide a robust assessment of potential environmental impacts and risks. This also provides flexibility at the contracting stage with regards to the selection of detailed methods for decommissioning. I acknowledge that this has the potential to create a very wide scope of appraisal. For this reason, it may be appropriate to screen some potential activities out of further environmental appraisal as a part of Step 2 of the process, particularly as options for the decommissioning become more firm. Throughout this process, it also pays dividends to keep in mind the source pathway receptor model, whereby only impacts or risks that satisfy the SPR model are considered. This slide provides a list of some of the activities that are well worth consideration. I won't read them out. Instead, I'll focus on some of the parameters and the subtleties associated with these. Physical parameters may cover a broad range of infrastructure types, ranging from small discrete items through to the decommissioning of extensive integrated installations, pipelines, and associated infrastructure. It's therefore important to clearly define the scope of the environmental appraisal from the outset. It's also important to agree this scope with OPRED. This is to ensure the appraisal presents the level of information expected and to avoid the forgotten about conversation that no one really wants to have with the regulator. In most cases, decommissioning activities will fall within parameters set by operating licenses. This will take cognizance that very few installations on the UK continental shelf are truly independent. They often share pipelines, processing, and accommodation and control facilities, to name a few examples. Spatial parameters concern the geographic boundary or extent of the likely impacts from the decommissioning programme. Something to be conscious of here is the need to clearly define the spatial extent of the appraisal. For example, removed infrastructure is likely to be brought onshore for cleaning, dismantling, and final disposal. Assuming that appropriately licensed onshore facilities are used, it would be fair to expect onshore environmental effects to be managed in accordance with environmental management systems, permits, and consents held by the dismantling facility. It's therefore reasonable for the environmental appraisal to only provide a summary description of expected onshore activity, sufficient to give assurance that environmental issues can be appropriately managed under existing onshore management systems. Some activities carried out in preparation for decommissioning will be undertaken under the management of existing operational controls and permits. These are what I would consider to be regulatory parameters. I won't dwell on these, having spent so long on legislation earlier in the talk. Methodology parameters should consider the execution methodology for the decommissioning programme. For example, whether the plan includes single lift or cut and lift for jackets. Equipment choice will also influence the nature and magnitude of environmental interaction associated with the programme. Throughout the environmental appraisal process, standard environmental mitigation measures can be assumed for the project execution. For example, the use of marine mammal observers prior to undertaking underwater operations that generate significant sound levels. This means that the appraisal can focus on the environmental issues which are most pertinent. It is, however, recommended that assumptions concerning inbuilt mitigation measures are clearly documented and revisited throughout the process to ensure their ongoing validity. Based on the parameters and activities identified during Step 1, the next stage is to consider the environmental interactions with these. One way to do this is via the development of a matrix identifying the potential interactions with the environment in association with each activity. This can be recorded within an M/D matrix. I acknowledge that it is more common practice to develop a detailed understanding of the environmental baseline prior to identifying the potential for environmental effects. However, the DECOM North Sea EIA Working Group, which developed the environmental appraisal guidelines, identified that in many cases the baseline could be more focused to report on material issues. So, what we proposed is that there is an opportunity, before doing extensive work to establish and characterise the baseline, to streamline this process. In this regard, knowledge gained from environmental data collected during the field development and operational phase can be used to support the development of the environmental hazard matrix. We would also expect the operator to already have an understanding of the key environmental sensitivities associated with the asset via their environmental management systems. As a result, the MID process would typically be delivered by a structured workshop attended by appropriately qualified decommissioning team members. This would include experienced engineers, project managers, and environmental professionals. In some cases, there may also be value in including key external stakeholders in the workshop. This would support consideration of stakeholder requirements, constraints, and concerns in anticipation of the Decommissioning Programme's consultation phase. During the MID workshop, it's useful to start with a baseline of environmental interaction areas that should be considered. This can be at a high level to prompt workshop attendees' thoughts on potential environmental impacts and risks that may arise from each activity. For example, you're likely to get seabed disturbances as a result of burial of existing infrastructure, or remediation of the seabed, or as a result of excavation techniques. You may need to consider underwater noise as a result of the use of explosives, as a result of rock dumping, or because of underwater cutting or tool operations. To inform the environmental appraisal, the current condition of the receiving environment needs to be understood. This understanding should be sufficient to allow for activity-receptor interactions and environmental sensitivities to be evaluated and reported. During the characterization stage, it's especially important to consider whether the decommissioning activities will have the potential to impact upon special areas of conservation or special protection areas. It's also important to consider other designated areas such as Ramsar sites, nature conservation marine protected areas, marine conservation zones, or sites of special scientific interest. Where the activities will affect a designated site, OPRED should be engaged as early as possible to determine the need for a likely significant effects assessment or a full appropriate assessment. Where these are required, the data gathered by the operator as part of the environmental appraisal should be both qualitative and quantitative. This should enable confirmation of the proportion of the protected site or species likely to be affected by the decommissioning activities. It is the responsibility of the operator to satisfy themselves that the environmental baseline data is adequate to inform the environmental appraisal. It's therefore important to consider whether there are any data gaps, and in particular, whether any data gaps have the potential to reduce confidence in the environmental appraisal's conclusions. For those gaps that may have a material effect on the robustness of the appraisal, there is a need to efficiently fill the gaps. To do this, it may be necessary to commission targeted surveys. Bearing this in mind, I recommend that gap reviews of existing data are undertaken at the earliest opportunity in the decommissioning planning process. This is to ensure that any new surveys can be executed and interpreted in a timely manner. The slide I've got up at the moment provides a useful list of data sources when undertaking the baseline characterization. Whilst characterizing the baseline, it's also useful to consider a number of other factors. The slide up at the moment provides a list of those factors, which includes things like physico-chemical baseline data, threshold limits in the local environment, the location of wrecks or marine cultural heritage, benthic fauna, or habitat classifications and designations. Once the environmental baseline is understood and potential environmental interactions have been identified, it should be possible to generate a long list of potential environmental impacts and risks based upon the results of the MHAS-ID that have been undertaken at an earlier stage. It should then be possible to further assess and prioritize those impacts and risks considered to be significant. This should consider factors such as the sensitivity of receptors, the magnitude of environmental change, legislative compliance, stakeholder concerns or constraints, and how the highest significant environmental aspects, impacts and risks should be managed in accordance with best environmental practice and best available techniques. There are a number of methods and processes to support the scoring and prioritization of environmental impacts and risks. The best recognized of these methods is to use prioritization matrices to whittle down the long lists of environmental impacts and risks to a shorter list of those impacts and risks that require active control. This slide provides an illustrative matrix that enables consideration of the sensitivity of receptors against the magnitude of change. This can be used to prioritize the bulk of attention to receptor interactions that fall within the bottom right of the matrix. This slide is intended to highlight some subtleties that are worth considering when undertaking the assessment and prioritization of environmental impacts and risks associated with the decommissioning programme. When assessing and prioritizing environmental impacts and risks, the criteria used to do this should be clear, unambiguous, robust, and proportionate to the project. This is illustrated by the curve on the right of the slide. In this curve, arbitrary boundaries have been set for the high, medium, and low priority areas. The assessment is therefore entirely reliant upon setting the correct definitions and criteria for each of the likelihood and severity scores. The curve also highlights the relative additional weighting that should be applied to consideration of severity of consequence. For example, if you flip the likelihood and severity columns, you would get a greater weighting upon likelihood. Boundaries in the curve are analogous to the boundaries within a risk class matrix. This also illustrates the importance that once criteria have been set for severity and likelihood, that placing the boundaries in the correct places is essential to inform a robust assessment. Having undertaken the environmental appraisal and identified significant environmental impacts and risks associated with the decommissioning programme, the next stage is to write an environmental assessment report, detailing the assessment that's been undertaken and outlining how significant environmental impacts and risks will be managed and mitigated. A typical structure of the environmental assessment report is provided on this slide. To the right of the slide, I've also provided a template that is recommended by BASE for use within decommissioning programs. This provides a summary of the environmental assessment that's been undertaken and largely refers back to the environmental assessment report. As a last pointer, and to close the webinar, it's well worth consideration of how the body of evidence behind reports will be maintained. There are lots of ways to do this, with typical methods including claims argument evidence database or storage or a register of live files that are updated throughout the decommissioning programme. Thank you all for taking the time to listen to this webinar. This slide provides some useful documents and links to useful reference information if you want to find out more. Otherwise, hold on and we can move on to the question and answer session.
Right, thank you very much, Ian. Now we've had quite a few questions come in. One of the main questions I think that people have been asking is, will the slides be made available? And the answer is yes, they will be. If you registered properly for this thing, you'll be receiving an email with a version of these slides, the on-demand version of these slides, so everyone will have copies. Now, quite a few people have been submitting questions, so I've got quite a list here to go through that I'll be putting to Ian. The first one was requirements of pipelines, Ian. Are there any specific requirements of pipelines or any particular treatments that are needed for that?
So my understanding, Simon, is that there are currently no international guidelines on the decommissioning of disused pipelines, and they're not currently part of OSPAR Decision 98.3. However, the UK regulator does believe there has to be a robust process that's considered for pipeline decommissioning, and as a result, they have adopted the principles from OSPAR 98.3 around comparative assessment. The actual environmental assessment is also a requirement for decommissioning a pipeline, so you would expect to see an environmental appraisal for a pipeline decommissioning project.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so how does the, you mentioned earlier on that a formal environmental impact assessment, which is something that's required in other sectors, isn't required. How does the environmental assessment that is required for an offshore decom compare to the techniques used in other industries?
So in other industries, where there's no statutory requirement for environmental impact assessment, it's actually very similar. You would expect to see a similar process whereby there was some environmental hazard ID, followed by detailed assessments or more detailed assessments of the significant environmental impacts and risks, and you would expect to see those reported through the decommissioning programme.
Okay, so could that approach be applied to a couple of people who asked this question? Would it be the same approach for offshore wind and other offshore non-oil and gas energy generation?
So I would expect to see a similar environmental appraisal approach, although I'm not an expert on the legislation in that sector. So you may well find that there are some subtleties in the legislation associated, for instance, decommissioning of offshore wind assets. I would expect to see a very similar environmental appraisal approach, though.
Okay, so it's a similar methodology. Do you know if OPRED also covers the wind things, like purely oil and gas?
I know that BASE regulate the renewable sector, so I think OPRED are probably purely oil and gas, but BASE would be regulating decommissioning in the renewable sector. There's
a question here about whether decommissioning is part of the operations and design philosophy, I imagine, for a new project.
I would expect that decommissioning should be part of the planning process for a new project. I suppose outside of the environmental arena, purely from the basis of understanding the through-life cost of the asset and planning sensible through-life costs and not giving yourself a substantial burden at the end of life of the asset. You can also design for the environment, so essentially making sure that you facilitate simpler decommissioning and reducing certain hazardous materials within the design, and ultimately that can improve your environmental performance at the decommissioning stage.
Okay, lovely. Now, we've had a couple of questions about obligations and legal obligations, whether the legal obligation outlasts the company. In fact, I think that's probably one I could answer, isn't it? Which is that how do the operators carry that liability into the future if they cease to exist or sell the asset? And usually, the who owns the decommissioning asset is a big part of the big part of the discussion when an asset is sold. I know that historically there has been a tax allowance made for future decommissioning, which has over the years been eroded slightly, but is still there. So there is a provision made historically for carrying some of those costs, and that provision can be passed on with the asset. But it depends very much on who's agreeing what. If an operator ceases to function, if it goes bust, then it returns to the department, I believe, is ultimately who carries the can. So someone always does carry that responsibility for decommissioning. I believe that's also the case with pipelines. Now, questions about concrete reefs and whether or not jackets can be better treated as reefs, whether that's best practice or whether that's something that's been done widely. I mean, Ian, your view on the use of, or the leaving in situ as reefs?
So that's one I think I might sit on the fence on, to be honest, Simon. I think it's quite controversial. There are lots of different opinions which option is best. I think that it comes down to the specific asset and the specific location. And I think it comes down to the comparative assessment that's done to do with leaving things in situ, and also the science-based arguments that you'd want to see in order to justify leaving things in situ. Now, my understanding is that there have been a few derogations approved to leave things in situ. I'd expect to have seen quite strong scientific arguments justifying why that was the best option.
Certainly, I've seen, obviously, there's some left in place in the North Sea, Frigg being the biggest currently condeep that's been left in place, and there are talks about doing that for other condeeps. I have seen a best practice report for a Southern Californian platform, where they had a scenario similar to the famous Brent Spar situation. And I know in that particular case, the assessment looked at multi-criteria methodologies for assessing whether it's better to leave in place, whether the harm the removal was greater. And I think the swinging argument there was that fishermen pointed out that the fishing catches were greater before a previous one had been removed. And therefore the case was made that it was better for subsea wildlife to leave in place. But it is case by case, and I think these environmental assessments need to be done in order to justify leaving that in place. And of course the big question with the condeeps and other big concrete structures is the stuff inside them, which is potentially extremely poisonous. Non-seabed contact methods to avoid seabeds to assess seabed will be disturbed by the fish. I think that probably comes back to the question about environmental impact and how you assess that.
Yeah. So sorry, can you clarify the question, Simon?
I believe that the point is that the removal process is ideally without disturbing the seabed. In assessing the safety of the seabed for future use, so it's got to be left in such a condition that it's safe for fishermen to trawl and doesn't snag nets and then isn't a bit pointless since the seabed will be disturbed by fishing activity. And I think it's a safety issue rather than environmental in that case. It's making sure that nets are not snagged and boats dragged under.
I would agree with that, Simon. I think that part of leaving a clear seabed is for other users of the sea and for their benefit.
Is there a limitation on offshore assets? Now, I know there is in the Gulf of Mexico. There is a legal requirement to decommission within 5 years. Is there one in the UK that you're aware of?
I'm not 100% aware of that. There may well be, but I'm not 100% aware.
How long does one of these environmental programs take to complete anyway? I mean, the full process for getting environmental approval if you're decommissioning, how long does it take?
Well, I think that one of the lengthiest things is the stakeholder consultation process. And you would actually also expect to see, one of the things that you can start to do is, if you know that there are going to be certain surveys that are required, for instance, to inform your environmental baseline, you may actually start to do some of those surveys prior to actually cessation of production from that asset. Mm-hmm. So in some cases you might actually want to start doing the appraisal well ahead of ceasing production.
So that could take about a year. What about then the subsequent, the sort of, you've got your NTASOP, the assessment of options, the risk thing you look at. How long would that rest of it take, roughly?
I would suggest that you need to leave at least 6 to 12 months to do it properly, and to allow to actually schedule in surveys and things like that if you need to.
It's a lengthy process.
Yes. I think the key thing there is it'll depend on which asset you're looking at and whether there's a significant requirement for surveys, and also whether or not, for instance, the appropriate assessment or habitat regulations assessments and things like that are required. And if they need further information and further data, those are the sort of things that can lead to delays in the environmental assessment process.
Okay. There's a question here about the estimate of the amount of waste from offshore decommissioning activities. I believe it's something that's been published by Decom North Sea or Oil and Gas UK. I forget which body has done that. Quite a lot seems to be the answer. There are some 350 plus platforms in the North Sea alone that need decommissioning, with an average weight of hundreds of thousands of tons, hundreds to thousands of tons. So we're looking at a lot. Is the answer. 2,379 wells, here we go. So alone, so 203 fields, 950,000 tonnes, there we go, I knew there was a number published here. 950,000 tonnes of topsides and forecast to be across the North Sea, of which 605,000 tonnes will be from the UKCS. So a good amount of money, and 5,724 kilometres of pipelines. So we're looking at a lot of waste, is the short answer. Do these also cover onshore disposal activities, the offshore regulations, the OSPAR and OPRED? I mean, how do they? At which point do they cease to be involved?
I would expect to see onshore the onshore disposal activities regulated by potentially different regulators. So you might see that actually onshore it might be regulated by CPERD, the Environment Agency, Natural Resources Wales, for instance. In that regard, you'd expect the offshore sites, so the onshore sites, so the sites that are actually undertaking the works, to have relevant permits and consents under environmental permitting regulations, for instance, and you would expect them to be operating separate environmental management systems to enable those activities. Some of the waste management regulations would also apply more directly to the onshore facilities.
Okay, so in other words, the overarching regulations that cover both obviously go onshore, but
Yes.
do you need to, when you're considering, say, some of the top science removal stuff offshore, do you also have to take into account what would subsequently happen to it when it goes onshore? Does that happen anyway?
You'd expect to, through the appraisal process, you'd expect to have to consider what will happen to it when it arrives onshore. So looking at the opportunities for recycling, the opportunities for reuse, how you're actually going to dismantle it, and things like that.
And what about things like gas terminals, where it comes onshore? Does that count as a semi-offshore asset?
So that would be part of the environmental appraisal.
Yeah.
And it would count, you'd have to accommodate the different regulatory regimes within that.
Okay.
Appraisal.
There might be a bit of overlap.
Yeah, there will be some overlap.
Yeah. Guidance removal of subsea wells and equipment. I believe there are some government guidance on plugging and abandonment specifically.
I'm not 100%.
Yeah, there are certainly some. There are fairly strict rules which are published by the government on plugging and abandonment standards and requirements for the wells themselves. They're quite strict about the degree of plugging that needs doing, and the marking and the inspection and everything that goes with that. That's certainly quite clear. Subsea equipment, which is presumably things like subsea trees and manifolds and so on, well, that falls under the remit of everything Ian's been describing so far in terms of the removal requirements and the environmental assessment requirements. Possible recommissioning. If an offshore pipeline is decommissioned, could an assessment account for possible recommissioning or reuse, storing of hydrogen?
I suspect, I don't know if the environmental assessment itself would account for that, but I think that would be something that would have to be assessed by engineers looking at whether or not the pipeline is structurally okay to be reused, and whether or not the way that it's been managed is appropriate for reuse as well, because I should imagine that different uses will mean that you actually have to assure the reliability of that pipeline. So I suspect that's more of an engineering question before we get to the actual environmental appraisal point.
Now, reuse and recycling applies to things other than just pipelines. But how do you, is that something that is assessed alongside other options in the environmental assessment? How do you deal with reuse and recycling as part of the process?
So you would expect the waste hierarchy to be followed during the decommissioning process, and you would expect to see if there are opportunities to reuse bits of equipment. That would be the ideal situation. If not, the next step would probably be the recycling of that equipment. I suspect, though, that actually reuse of some of the equipment would be subject to how reliable it may be if it is reused, and also whether or not that reused equipment, is there actually a market for that equipment?
Yeah.
And what the risk of using equipment that's already been used would be to operators, for instance.
Yes, and I think that's something that the UK could do a bit better. I mean, there's currently a government consultation on decom in the North Sea, and I think that something the UK does not do very well is identifying reuse for high value kit. I think things like gas turbines, fair enough, they obviously get reused, but electronic switchgear and so on is potentially high value, not reused. Pressure vessels, but I mean, there's quite a big scope for reuse that is not fully, I mean, some companies looking at it, not fully exploited. Question here, do the environmental and ecological studies have to be completed by an independent company to avoid clashes of interest?
I'm not 100% certain on that, the answer on that one. I would suggest that because the regulator is involved in this, and so are the statutory nature conservation bodies, and you would expect them, if it is in a protected area, to do some form of appropriate assessment or habitat regulations assessments. And that would be independent, so independent from the actual operator.
So there would be some sort of independent technical assurance stuff. Even if the operator had done the case initially,
yes,
there would be a third party looking over it.
Yes,
yeah,
that's right.
Monitoring during the actual decommissioning process, how's that done? I mean, does there an environmental team
you would
attached to the
expect to
project?
see some level of monitoring during the environmental process. So an area, if I get the question right here, for instance, if you know that you're going to be, for instance, using techniques that generate significant levels of noise, you may well have marine mammal observers present at the actual decommissioning, during the decommissioning process.
Yeah. So there is. Yeah.
There would be some requirements.
Ongoing. Yeah. What about leaks and spillage? Presumably that's just.
That would be managed largely under standards of MARPOL type requirements. So which would generally govern shipping.
Yeah.
Things like that.
Okay. Yeah. Question. Well, it's another one here about keeping the. Are we aware of any situation? Well, yes, that has happened. I mean, the Frigg platform has been left in situ for environmental grounds. I mentioned the. I've forgotten the name of the Southern Californian structure, Topaz, I think it might have been, but there's a Southern Californian platform that has been left in situ following an environmental assessment, and of course the infamous Brent Spar. After the initial assessment was overturned by pressure, Greenpeace actually admitted that they made a mistake and that leaving in situ would have been better for the environment. So there are situations where the assessment has been done and the conclusion has been that it's better to leave in place than to decommission. So that's definitely happened. Someone has asked about Brexit, and inevitably, and the effect. But I imagine that there shouldn't be any effect because OSPAR is outside. It's a non-EU instrument because it's with Norway.
Yeah, I would expect that largely the requirements do fall into international obligations or fall under international obligations. So there will be an impact from Brexit, but I should imagine that it won't be immediate. My understanding at the moment around Brexit is that there will be an environmental bill that essentially is established to manage transition of environmental regulations within the UK. I wouldn't expect those to change significantly from where they currently stand. I think that the requirement for an environmental appraisal will still be there regardless.
Yeah, no, well, probably good practice, isn't it? Why are marine mammals more protected than fish? It always crops up, marine mammals.
I'm not 100% certain, to be honest, Simon. I think some of it is probably perception, but I actually am not 100% certain.
Okay, well, lovely. And now the actual process of submitting the environmental assessment.
Yeah.
So presumably, what does the operator do? Does the operator submit a pack that says, right, this is how we're going to decommission it, and here's the supporting environmental evidence? And then who approves it? Does the OPRED approve, or do they?
So I would expect the environmental appraisal to be provided to the regulator alongside the decommissioning programme and any comparative assessments that have been undertaken. In reality, you'd expect the regulator to have been engaged through the development of the environmental assessment anyway, or throughout the undertaking of that. But yeah, I'd expect it to be provided as part of the pack of information linked to the decommissioning programme that gets approval from the regulator. So it is part of the pack of information that justifies that approval.
Okay. Now there's a question here about particularly good examples of EIA, and these I think that might be because EIA is a methodology actually applied to oil and gas. But can you think of any good cases outside the oil and gas industry where EIAs have been successfully used to give an environmentally beneficial solution?
Good examples elsewhere as well. So I think
there aren't that many in the North Sea, unfortunately, as I'm aware of at the moment.
I'll say around this. So if you actually log on to the BASE website and actually have a look at .gov.uk, there are currently 11 programmes under consideration and more than 85 approved decommissioning programmes.
85.
Yeah. And on that there are environmental appraisals that are available to have a look at across all of those. I'd rather not say which ones I think are better than others, so that would be a bit controversial. So
fair enough.
I think if you log on and have a look at those particular environmental appraisals,
so it's beis.gov.uk.
it's just if you do a search for decommissioning offshore assets and then look at the .gov.uk website, there's a list. So that'll probably be a good place to look at. In fact, it's I have got it up on the screen.
Oh, was it up on? I think it's on this. I'm sorry. From here, we're looking at the. I can't go back on here. But okay, so it'll be on there.
Yeah.
Right. Well, that's a fantastic range of questions. There's been some immense interest in this, and I have to say that in terms of the number of people who've signed up for this one, this is I think the best we've ever had from the oil and gas side of things. I think we've run out of questions now. So we're just about done. I'd like to thank everyone for attending. Thank Ian very much for putting this together. This has been a very interesting presentation. There's clearly a lot of interest in the topic. Those of you who signed up will be getting copies of the slides. Thank you for attending. Our next presentation will be, our next webinar from the oil and gas side of things will be in Q3 this year and will be on the subject of produced water treatment. And I hope you can join us for that. Thank you very much.
Thank
Bye.
you.